Hi. So, good evening, everyone on YouTube and Facebook watching us live. Thank you for joining us tonight for our panel discussion on dancehall, folklore, and queerness, featuring Kimalea Campbell, Erin Greene, and Gervais Marsh is going to join us later on this evening. So, just to jump right into it, my name is Jodi Minnis. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm the gallery manager of TERN Gallery, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I'm going to read our panelists' bios so we could just get to know a little about who they are before we jump right into the discussion. So, Kimalea Campbell, whose pronouns are he, him, is a prolific creative consultant. He's an expert administrator, organizer, communicator, and behind the scenes system thinker. He has architect projects that integrates music, culture, and content production and delivers long-term impact for creators, brands, organizations, and communities. Campbell's focus is on cultivating opportunities for emerging artists and creatives in the Caribbean and the Global South. He is a Growth Wheel certified business advisor and holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Art Management from Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts. Thank you, Kimalea. Erin Greene is a local intersectional human rights advocate with a focus on LGBTI rights, women's rights, and food security. Erin's pronouns are she, her. Erin is also an improv political satiritrist. Did I pronounce that right? I think so. Actor and performance and visual artist. She's the host of On the Clock with Erin Greene, a local radio show. And lastly, Gervais Marsh is a writer, scholar, and curator whose work is deeply invested in Black life, concepts of relationality, and care. Their writing, artistic, and curatorial work is rooted in the transnational Black feminist theory and praxis, and their research areas include Black studies, art history, Caribbean studies, and gender and sexuality studies. They are a PhD candidate in performance studies at Northwestern University, and their dissertation explores modes of relationality and generative possibilities that emerge from engaging questions of difficult intimacies and irreconcilable differences in the work of several Black queer visual and performance artists. They grew up in Kingston, Jamaica, a home that continues to shape their understanding of self and relationship to the world. So thank you all for joining us, Erin and Kimalea. And Gervais's pronouns are they, them. Thank you. I think we're going to jump right into it. We had a side conversation before we started, but I think it segues us into the first component of the discussion, which is defining dancehall culture and how that's apparent in Leasho Johnson's exhibition, A Deep Haunting. I know when I sent the brief, I was thinking specifically about, and I'm going to ask Ramel, who's on the back end, to pull it up, Leisho's work, Baka Road, from 2014. It was an installation in the National Art Gallery of Jamaica. And I think that's where we first see Leisho like constructing this idea of this like culture, this like scene, this setting. So can you both talk to just the defining of the culture of dancehall?
Hi, thanks for having me, Jodi. And TERN, nice meeting Erin. And hello to everybody who's viewing. So, dancehall is a relatively new phenomenon for us, because we're relatively young. We're just 60 years old. So a couple days from now, we're 60 years old. But dancehall started off in the early 1980s as a spin-off from reggae. With the introduction of technology in the music making. But dancehall in and of itself, as it relates to culture, it is a space of resistance. And it became a space where people from mostly lower economical communities within Jamaica, mostly specifically Kingston, gathered to celebrate in a way, or to have a space to share their shared experiences. But as it relates to dancehall, when we talk about dancehall, people talk about just the music, but dancehall was never just the music. It started off as a space, and then it transcend into culture, food, dance, fashion, all the different things as it relates what we consider dancehall now. So as it relates to Leasho's work, dancehall especially this one, Baka Road, is a space where people that have shared experience come together to talk about that shared experience. So it's really communal, where they come together to experience and to um, show that as much as we're struggling, we are embodying this resistance. We are taking power, and creating space to empower ourselves. But dancehall is at the same time, even though it's a very liberal space, it's a very balanced space at the same time, especially when we listen to our lyrical content. So we are, as it relates to dancehall, I think Dr. Stanley Nair in one of her articles said that dancehall music is in a state of ongoing struggle between respectability and riot, property and vulgarity, slackness and culture. And funny enough, when we talk about slackness in the Jamaican dialect, we talk about being wild and out there. But at the same time, we use that as a tool to empower ourselves and to create space and to be proudful or to be proud of who we are and to create some sense of self and community. So that's what I see dancehall as a space where people come together who have shared experience, to to commune and to create a sense of identity and belonging.
Because I know that it sounds like dancehall functions similarly here in the Bahamas as it does in Jamaica, but because of the origins, it's a, I don't know if imported is the best word to use, but it's a imported kind of culture as well that came with a growing Jamaican populace in the Bahamas. So, how would you define dancehall? How would you define the culture of dancehall?
I think it's very dynamic, eclectic. Um, when you're in it, and energetic. From outside looking in, it might seem very scary and violent and chaotic, but that's the thing that makes it so alluring. It seems so out of this world and so raunchy and distasteful, but at the same time, while you're experiencing it, it's so, it's a sense of belonging. Erin, you were saying something?
Yeah, so you have to unmute yourself. Sorry, Erin. Let's unmute you there. There you go.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so first of all, I want to say that I'm not Jamaican, and so I'm okay, right? I just want to be able to sort of jump in. I can't frame it out, and I would talk about my experience of dancehall in the Bahamas, right, in that generation, because in a sense, like thinking back on my peers, you can't tell them that the dancehall isn't theirs, right? You can't tell them that they weren't actively and authentically a part of that experience. Their relationship with the artists, right, and their imagining of the space. Because we experienced dancehall in two ways: in the club and on the mixtape, right? And we had the various DJs who would put out a tape every week, every other week of the newest rhythms, the newest tracks, and so that's how we experienced it. So even in that, I'm on the fringes, and I'm okay, and that's where I want to be for right now. But I wanted to say this sort of, it's not a dichotomy because it's more symbiotic. The property and the vulgarity. And what you said just now, Kimalea, like the violence and almost the performance, like think back to like medieval times, right? The performance where the gent and the lady perform together. That I thought about Japan and the allure of dancehall and Jamaican culture in Japan, and how they're so drawn to it, and how dancehall is so opposed to uh, that space, and performance is so opposed to Japanese culture,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, and just sort of expanding on what you were saying, Kimalea, that that it is a a social space. It is church. It is performance. It is music. It is dance performance. It is fashion performance, um, and it's also like the DJ is such an important part, because I think about it, to the Bahamian party where they're playing dancehall. The Bahamian DJ talks just as much as the song plays.
Yeah, but it's true. The commentary
Mhm,
is an important part of it,
Right.
um,
mhm,
because it's like that, because dancehall music, it when you listen to it, separate and apart from being in the social space, like the lyrical content, it is speaking about the daily lives of the persons who, what we're experiencing. So it is commentary, and the DJ is really, talking about it,
mhm,
and then communicating that with the audience. But it's also a very sexual space as well. If we look at this work that Leasho did in 2014, it is very sexual. But at the same time, so there's a lot of intersectionality happening in a dancehall space. It's a very violent space, but at the same time, it's a very sexual space, but at the same time, it's a very political space. So there's
Yeah.
mhm,
a lot of intersectionality that happens within that space at the same time.
Yeah.
mhm,
So I would motion just to bring it to the current exhibition. I
mhm,
think the piece, I'm gonna get the name right, is Anansi and the River Maiden. Anansi 96. If you could bring that up, Ramel. Uh, because I think in thinking about like the multidimensionality of dancehall and thinking about the and that's why I wanted to talk about the culture specifically of it, because it is a culture within itself. Like your body language, once you get into a space where dancehall music is present, your body language changes, the way in which you want to like present to be able to, stretch and flex and bend, you know what I mean? Like the clothing is different to like accompany the things, the actions that you want to do in it, your and I'm speaking as a Bahamian, as somebody who has only experienced dancehall in the Bahamas, and in the U.S. Is that there is this there's this idea of like this emulation, or like this like you have to put not put on, but like to be a part of it. Is there's a specific thing that you're accessing, a specific way of life that you're accessing to participate in this culture. And I like what you said, Kimberly, about the and Erin, about the DJ's interaction with it, because when you listen to like dancehall music from the 80s, it sound you hear that like dance hall sound system, someone on top of a rhythm, like deconstruction more than you do now in like with more present day dancehall music. And I see that Gervais is in the house. If you just want to slide in here, um, welcome, Gervais. How you doing?
I'm good. Sorry I'm late.
No,
I
you're
completely miss like I didn't even think about the time difference.
it's yeah, it's time
And
zones really don't make sense to me either. So
yeah, well today it was not making sense to me, so
we,
Um,
we were just in conversation about defining dancehall culture, and what that is, and just understand
violent dancehall culture you said?
defining.
Defining dancehall
Yeah,
culture. Okay.
mhm,
yeah, because it presents differently. Because Leisho's exhibition is in the Bahamas, it presents differently in the Bahamas, and the history of that culture is different here. And Erin and I were speaking from that perspective. But of course, you and Kimalea, being both Jamaican, have a different understanding of the culture and how it exists in Jamaica. So I don't know if you wanted to give your definition or your insights on what all that culture encompasses.
You're asking me specifically, right?
Yeah, because they can answer.
I just, I mean, it's hard because there's so many layers to it, you know. And I think that there's a way in which dancehall gets simplified.
For sure.
And I think, you know, dancehall is music, it's dance, it's fashion, it's also a kind of way of understanding being in relation to other people. It's also about sound. It's about the sound system. Like there's just so many there's so many layers to it, and I think each of those then can be broken down into sub layers, you know.
For sure.
And so it's hard for me to say what it is, you know, or what it means. I think in relation to Leasho's work, something that I've thought that is interesting for me is the way that Leasho uses dancehall or engages dancehall to think about gender, to think about sexuality, to think about relationality, and also to think about class, and particularly Black working class understandings of those things. So gender, sexuality, like race, things like that, right? And I think dancehall is a really fertile space to think about those questions. And I really appreciate the ways that Leasho engages dancehall in that particular way, and thinking about the kinds of visual representations or the visual kind of explorations that he can do.
Yeah.
While thinking about dancehall in those ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I brought up Anansi and the River Maiden. Specifically, I think this panel discussion was birthed out of a conversation that I had with Kimalea, because we were looking at that piece in particular in the gallery, and you know, a lot of people were talking about like the sexual suggestiveness of it, you know, and then Kimalea was like, no, she pun head top, you know, and this, that, and that. Like
Mm-hmm.
I was able to then, and that's why I brought up this piece after I brought up Baka Road from 2014, because once you look at Leisho's practice from this like evolutionary perspective, yeah, you really can't flatten it, like you're saying. You can't.
I mean, for me, and this works specifically, and I mean, just to contextualize it for persons who don't know who Anansi is a West Africa um,
Trickster.
folklore. Folklore,
Yeah.
and he's a trickster. And he really, that's what he does. He goes around and he tricks people. And with a river maid now, what we call Jamaica river mama or mermaid. We don't say mermaid, it's mermaid. So a mermaid is a river mama, so a woman or a mermaid who kind of allures men specifically into the river. So she's very attractive and she sings. So it's similar to what a regular mermaid is. Yeah. With Anansi being a trickster, and he can, in our context, and can turn into anybody that he want to turn into. And then because with understanding the Jamaican context being of a particular persuasion, in this context being a part of the LGBT community, or more specifically gay in Jamaica, you have to know how to navigate spaces. So even though you might be straight gay and you're coming from a very hostile community, you have to know how to navigate these different spaces to ensure that your safety and your sense of belonging is not threatened. So you have to become a trickster. So the people that you will trust the most are seeing a different version of you versus somebody who you're most intimate with. It's a different version of you.
If I could say, one of the things Bahamians have sort of pulled out of dancehall culture is the idea, the junglist, right?
Yeah.
In Bahamian culture, the junglist is the slack woman who will do anything to score off your man or to score your man. And I say, no, the junglist is a far more savvy and sophisticated and enlightened, right? Like being that understands code switching and class switching, and understands the need for, but not even the need for, but the importance of being and understanding the space that you're in and engaging, right? For all the same reasons. And so women tend to demonize the junglist, and men that sort of understand the play,
Yeah.
and are thankful for this opportunity of exchange, you know, and then see the junglist and their mother, and all a multitude of experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Even with that work specifically, Anansi and the River Maiden, I find it interesting because within a dancehall space, the dancehall space in and of itself is a queer space. Because when you're in a dancehall space, your sense of who identity and who you are kind of is blurred because of how the space operates. In our conversation earlier, I thought there was a point in time in Jamaica where cross dressing was a thing, where straight men are wearing women blouses and women pants, and it was very much accepted culturally.
They're not doing that anymore.
I mean, I've seen it a lot, but it's back or mid.
I just played with you.
Yeah, it was very much accepted. But for me, when I go into a space, just walking on the road, I'm paranoid just thinking of, I'm going to put on a woman blouse. And even though I'm a gay man, it seems more, and I think, it would be more acceptable. It is not. But when you go into a dancehall space, and it also trickles within our own social interaction, because when we talk about dancehall, when it just originated, was listened to by persons of lower economic and socio-economical standard. So persons who are in the ghetto, persons who are uneducated, didn't go to universities, who just are also. So those are the persons who really embedded dancehall. So I was talking about earlier as it relates to how trends in our culture is accepted. In a regular society, trends are from top down, but in Jamaica, it is bottom up. So let's say wearing a tights, it is more acceptable when persons from the inner city starts the trend or adopt international trends versus somebody from an up middle class family or economical disposition. So it's a weird space, but it's also a welcoming space, but at the same time, an hostile space.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, sorry, Jodi, you're going to say something.
Go right ahead.
No, I just think that I really appreciate what both of you just said. I think there's several offshoots. And one is that what I love about the way Leasho is thinking about abstraction and thinking through abstraction is that there's always multiple readings of each piece. And so it could be a girl on a head top, but also it could be somebody the characters can be intimate in so many different kinds of ways, right? So I can't say for sure that the girl first of all, I don't even know the gender of the person. So even me saying the girl on a head top, it's okay, I don't actually know the gender of the character or the figure in the piece, right? So already there, it's disrupting questions of gender, disrupting questions of sexuality. The figures are also not racialized, right? So they're painted in black, but they're not racialized as black, right? And so there's all this space for speculation of multiple readings. And I think dancehall is also this space where multiple readings can happen, because it's a very dynamic space, it's a very dynamic space. And somebody could be wearing a cis man could be wearing a woman's blouse and say, but when I'm wearing it, that's not what it is. It's fashion. You know what I mean? There's multiple readings that can happen in that space, but I think
it's interesting, Gervais, what you just said about and it just came to me. Dancehall happening most of the time in very dark spaces, so there's not a lot of light. So exactly. With Leasho using a lot of using black, I was reading some of the articles that they wrote about his previous work, and also this body of work. And they were talking about the embraces, but I'm like, is it an embrace? Because we don't know if they're just occupying space.
Exactly.
We don't know, because dancehall in and of itself happens in a very dark space. Exactly. So what exactly is it? So it is open to interpretation.
Exactly. And there are intimacies that are typically experienced in queer spaces. Women are so close together, not touching, maybe not even know each other, but obviously engaged, right? Intertwined, experiencing each other. It's such a queer space, and even in the Bahamas, queer in a way that men's intimacy is queer, and it doesn't have to necessarily be sexual, right? But
Exactly.
Bahamian men dance with each other with dancehall, right? To dancehall music. My friends, we used to sit in the road on the side of a house and with our cars and play music all night, and a space where men would dance together, in the club, tightly packed, a safe space to dance and be free, right? There's these intimacies in there, and then at the same time, you watching the performance, and the performance is like, why are y'all taking such an intimate thing and making it seem so not intimate, right? The what has become the very sexually hypersexual performance. Still a very intimate engagement, that can seem not intimate, but is very, very intimate. And in that space, men let women take charge.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean,
so
I think,
appreciate you saying that.
yeah, I mean, I think in an article, well, not article, it was a paper actually by Carlene Cooper, "Sweet and Sour Sexual Politics in Jamaica Dancehall Culture." That's something that she had mentioned too, that it is a space, and ladies are, she mentioned ladies are in the article, that ladies are embodied, that woman, what we probably in Jamaica would call a sketel, where they're very open about their sexuality and very vulgar about it, but at the same time, in a dancehall space, it is accepted. But when you move out of the dancehall space, it's like this sense of identity is looked down upon.
And that's what's so interesting. Yeah.
The intersectionality between Jamaica being a very, well, dancehall being a very liberal and vulgar space, versus when we move into our social lives, our regular day-to-day life, it contradicts how we operate in such spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you also you said it also earlier, Kimalea. Like, that's how I'm saying it right, Kimalea? Kimalea, yeah. Okay, just want to make sure. When I was really happy that you talked about that Jamaica. There's this whole there's a conversation between, and I have a lot of thoughts on this, of like Jamaican culture and the idea, and like Jamaican culture and what gets named as Jamaican culture, and most of that is Black working class folks and the cultural production and their cultural production, and then gets taken up as Jamaican culture for all classes of people, right? And it is like, it's not yet, like you said, it was like I think you said like bottom up or something like that, right? And I think that means a lot, and I think it means a lot for Leasho to be thinking about Black sexuality, Black queer sexuality, and queer both in terms of like thinking about people who identify with the same gender, being sexually attracted to each other, having desire, but also queer as in non-normative.
Right.
And so like intimacies that fall outside of the kind of normal societal understandings of intimacy, like Erin was talking about. Yeah. But to frame that and to position that as emerging from Black working class people, to think about our understandings of Black genders and sexualities as emerging predominantly, and knowledge about that emerging from Black working class people, I think is really powerful, because then it also then disrupts this hierarchy of the people who are shamed, the people who are looked down upon, the people who are pushed to the side by upper middle class, uptown Jamaicans, to say that actually, but everything you're learning about yourself is coming from them. You know what I mean? So it just disrupts this whole kind of power dynamic that Kimalea was naming, which I think is really powerful.
Or reflects a more natural movement of culture, right?
Yes.
That you see both in Jamaica with dancehall coming up, and in the wider space with queer culture at the root of modern urban culture, right? And coming up, and then understanding the queerness in that space, in that modern culture space, and then understanding the migrant influence on that space as well. And so when you go into New York 20 years ago, 40 years ago, today, is queer migrants, is African migrants, is Latin American migrants at the root, pushing that culture up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's spaces where it obfuscates, and somebody claims it. But if you're on YouTube, you see parodies and you see European choirs singing choral performances of dancehall,
Mm-hmm.
the rawest dancehall, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not covering the Bahamas National Choir, the Jamaican National Choir. You know,
Um,
they're going right to the root of it.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing for me that stands out in the dancehall is a queer space is the performance, the performers, the artists and their voices, the women and the men, and that the women have these strong male bass voices, spice, and men will perform the falsetto,
Yeah.
right? They get very high in their performance, and I just, but it's more the women, and there's this, they take on this, like you say, the assertiveness of the sketel, right?
yeah.
Uh, that they take on, and they come, and to imagine that I could be a Jamaican woman in dancehall performing, I come in and my pussy leading the way, huh? Come out the way. I come to mesmerize you. I've come to entertain you with all of myself. And another thing I love about it, and that I think is a queerness in the Jamaican space, is the what a Bahamian poet, I think Lynn Pierre, called pussy poetry and pussy power, right? So I have the shirt on today that I got while I was at a conference in Jamaica. Asked me about pum pum power, um, but it is the reclaiming of the power of the pussy in a space that I think culturally, if I could from the fringes say, culturally and spiritually would suggest to a woman that her shame is in the fact that she's a woman and has a vagina, right? Going all the way back to Eve. But in this dancehall space, women claim and declare the power of their vagina and the power of their womanness, and not just to seduce or persuade, but to get things done. I build a house. We have a Bahamian woman who tell you she built a house with a pussy, man. It is powerful.
Um,
Um,
isn't
yeah.
just to add or not to add? It's just I'm going on a tangent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so a couple years, 30 years ago, actually, because I'm 30, Boom Bye Bye was a thing by Buju Banton, right? And it was internationally and also locally, it was a thing where, the Buju Banton must sing that song, and it's very homophobic. Yes, it is, of course. But it's interesting how us Jamaican interpret the song. It is not, well, LGBT Jamaicans, as much as we do have activists who do speak about it and persons who I do interact with who are activists. And when we do go into dancehall space and they do play Boom Bye Bye, it is you, especially for us persons who are part of the LGBT community, it is seen, at least my interpretation, as a liberation or empowering. So we're in a space where we're being chastised and where we're being looked upon, but at the same time we use, boom bye bye, no bad boy, and we're still putting up our gun finger, because gun finger is like, oh, you're raving for the song, and yes, you're as much as it should make us, it's belittling. It is seen as a space for empowering and legitimacy in a way, and accepting, well, not accepting, taking space in a space where you are not welcome or seemingly not welcomed. So with that said, it's just about, with this body of work, is how Leasho, especially with the abstract one, not the portraits, most of the abstracts, they are really empowering, showing that empowerment that LGBT gay men, or, well, not even gay men, but whosoever they identify as, how they occupy space. And with it being a dancehall space, it's showing how we are willing to be risque in a way of creating and taking up space, knowing that it's still risky and it still might put our self or safety at risk. So even the one that we're talking about, Anansi and the River Maiden, is just about how these people navigate these spaces. Because a River Maiden, a gay man, can go into the space and they're luring straight men, gay men, whichever persuasion you may be. And when they go into an intimate space, whatever happens in that intimate space happens, but it can become a space where people do lurk to find partners and to find people of particular persuasions within a space where you don't think gay men would go and meet other gay men, or a lesbian would go and meet another lesbian woman. But it is a space where we do mask ourselves, like Anansi, who is a trickster, so that we can find other people or create community within a space that is seemingly hostile.
So
If I follow in those images, I see. I feel like there is a lot of feminine coming out of, Anansi is also performing his feminine self in that space, and it's safe to do so. And just like you said, that yeah, people are lurking, people are watching, and what we normally think is sexual intimacy and interaction in the dance hall space, people get off on each other without even touching, without even being in the same space, right? And so, with this image in particular, and with all of the images, I wondered if it is my bias as a lesbian woman that I'm seeing the feminine in all of it. But that's a part of navigating that space as well, and the freedom to be that, or for that part of yourself to be out and to be seen, in that space.
yeah. So this is so good. So good. But just to, I think Gervais brought it up between Gervais and Kimalea about the like black being used, or the intentional like blackness of the figures, and I think about how black absorbs light. So it's this absorption, it's this like gathering of all the things and the holding of all of the things. And I think that Leasho's work particularly holds a lot. So it holds space for the gender binary to not exist. It holds space
Exactly.
for the parallels, or the delineation between abstraction and figuration to exist. It holds because when I look at the works, I think about like how it's this landscape, you know what I mean? Or, art historical terms would like define it as like figures in the landscape. But I wonder if the figures are enveloped just by energy, is this like energetic, like ongoing sort of happening to like reinforce the movement of the figures. So I'm thinking primarily about this objection of Brother Snake, and I'm thinking about in this like all-encompassing, this like gathering of things. We think about Anansi, who, whenever I like research this phrase of Anansi being the god of all knowledge comes up. So we have this centralized figure within the space through which dancehall and queerness is being evoked, being something that is one god and encompassing or all knowing of the things that we define as knowledge, but also still being a trickster, which I think is so interesting. So I guess
and
I would
very queer,
that.
Yeah, and
I mean,
on multiple registers.
yeah. I mean, for
Sorry
me,
to cut you off, Jodi.
No, you're good.
sorry. Oh, for me, as it relates to it happening in the bush, I think because as gay men or members of the LGBT community within the Jamaican context, is that a lot of our intimacy happens within spaces that are not necessarily comfortable. because you have to be hiding who you are, and sometimes a lot of the place. And I mean, with the Caribbean, with Jamaica being in the Caribbean, and a lot of time, a lot of work coming from the Caribbean, is tend to be tropicalized. I think the forestry or it happening in the bushes kind of characterize what happens. You know, the fact that we can't necessarily engage intimacy within a comfortable space. So it has to be in a space where it is, especially when we talk about folklore within the Caribbean or within Jamaican context, a lot of the stories happens within the bush, on the riverside. So there is a work by the name of On the River Pandabank, and that work was speaking specifically towards two lovers having an intimate moment, and the bike at the bottom right, left of the page, signifying a quick getaway. And that's the type of approach that a lot of persons within the LGBT community faces when it comes to their intimacy. Even spaces that are deemed safe, they still have to be, even though you're in that space, you're still looking behind your back. You still, and there's a saying in Jamaica, bush have ears, meaning people, you know, anybody can hear anything. So you're in a space where you're being intimate, but at the same time, you still have to be very vigilant. And with it happening in the bush, you're in the bush being intimate, somebody can be walking in the bush. So even though it's still very a private situation, it's still a very public situation. You know what I mean? So you still have to be very vigilant and mindful of the spaces that you're occupying, even though while you're in the moment, you're like, okay, I think I'm safe. But at the back of your head, you're like, okay, if something happens, how can I get away?
Yeah. I also think there's like, sorry, Kimalea, were you was going to say something else?
Yeah, so I think with with it happening in the bush, it just shows it's speaking to somewhat private, but at the same time not a private space, even though what happens in your bedroom should be a private situation.
Yeah. I also think like when you talk about the fact that so much of the work, like this kind of discussion of tropicalization and like thinking about the Caribbean as being portrayed, particularly for those who don't live in the Caribbean, as idyllic. And so, you know, there's a way in which Leasho is engaging the landscape that is not reproducing this kind of these kinds of idyllic, different for like idyllic imagery, but also there's something about positioning a lot of the figures and the kinds of and the possibilities of interactions, different forms of intimacy that could be happening in each of the paintings in rural space. I think is really important because both outside of the Caribbean, but also even within, like even thinking about Jamaica, like there's this idea that queer life has to always retreat, like has to escape rural space and retreat to the city, right? And so in the US, for example, like it's like, oh, you know, all the like, queer folks who live in more rural areas or smaller towns, they have to escape and make it to big cities, right? They have to go to LA, they have to go to DC, they have to go to New York, whatever, you know? And I think even in Jamaica, this idea of like, oh, you have to leave smaller towns to go to Kingston because that's where you'll feel safer, that's where you'll find community. But I think there's something about naming that actually queer intimacies happen in all spaces, right? Both rural and urban. And there's like a particular decentering of the urban in the paintings that I think is really important to name. And also to think about, there's a particular kind of intimacy in understanding how to navigate rural space. And so it's also an understanding of the landscape. It's an understanding of, because it's like, yeah, you know, the bushes have eyes. And so you have to live somewhere long enough, grow up in a particular kind of place to know, okay, if I go down this path, you make your own, you know, like nobody knows this particular clearing except me. Or the belief is that nobody knows this particular kind of clear. So there's also another kind of knowledge of rural space and the rural landscape that I think is being centered here that I really appreciate in his work. And I think, Jodi, you were talking about both like, I don't know, there's this tension with abstracting and holding onto the figures, and that was something that I spoke to Leasho about, because I've been thinking about it for years, like since I first saw his work, like, why, and like, why do you hold on to the figures? And I mean, he told me, he felt like it was important for him to hold on to the figure, and I wrote this in the essay, like it was important for him to hold on to the figures because he's trying to engage in a particular kind of art historical conversation, a particular kind of like contemporary art conversation about Black figurative drawing, Black figurative painting, etc. But also I think there's a tension in that I'm not sure, like it gestures to different things. I'm still thinking about what that tension means, like what this holding on to the figure means, but also like their figures are still abstracted, and what does it mean to kind of think about the body and think about figures in that kind of open-ended way. That's really interesting. I just think it's generative. I don't know if there's an answer. I don't think there has to be an answer, in the same way that I don't think the figures have to have a gender, have to have a particular sexual, like have to be understood as queer in a very particular kind of way. Like I think it's about all the kinds of possibilities and nuances that make the work so generative.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you talk about the rural landscape, because I've seen the lushness of Jamaica, but New Providence is shrubbery, and any sort of like tropicality and like that like lush Caribbean like idea of what like bush looks like is fabricated space here, because it's pretty flat. It's pretty flat. We have a lot of shrubs like mangroves and all that, so on. That happens. But so I think particularly about his use of color, I lament on this phthalo blue that he uses, that I know that a lot of people use to render like beat scenes, and they use like these like idyllic like seascapes and so on. But he uses it in a way to like highlight the figure and to like kind of like pronounce the delineation between the background being in the landscape and the figure. And then sometimes it's solely just in the landscape, and sometimes it's solely just in the figure.
It's interesting with the blue. For me, I interpret it as moonlight, especially because dance don't happen in the day. You know what I mean? And a lot of our intimacy don't happen in the day either. So it just reminds me, of, it just felt like a moonlight, and a lot of our folklore do mention it being a full moon. So it was just, it was interesting that you mentioned the blue and how you interpret it.
I like that a lot, and I never thought about it as moonlight actually. So I really appreciate you saying that. That's interesting. I'm gonna think about it more.
And one more thing too, that Erin was saying earlier, as it relates to intimacy. What does intimacy look like? Because when we go into different spaces, and especially in a dancehall space, which is a very hostile space, masculine space, and really celebrating the woman's body, if a queer body goes into that space, or two queer body goes into that space, how do they communicate intimacy within that space? They can't be holding hands, so what does intimacy look like within the space itself? There are different moments where intimacy can be exchanged more overtly or covertly, but what does it look like? Which is a very, until Erin spoke about it being especially referencing lesbian women, and especially lesbian women tend to be more accepted within a dancehall space versus two gay men, which is interesting to me.
I mean, a lot of it's because they're desexualized, they're like either hypersexualized or like their sexuality is not viewed as legitimate in the way, like lesbian women don't pose the same kind of threat to masculinity in the ways that people often view gay men, particularly femme gay men, as posing a threat to a certain kind of masculinity,
it doesn't stop the fantasy.
Exactly.
And you may be as a lesbian empowered in that space, but you're essentially, sometimes you're being allowed to perform on their behalf.
Yeah, exactly.
And they accept it, and so is it a safe space? can you get out of there without the expectation that you will perform further, you know?
And it's still volatile, because things can change.
Yeah.
Like it's still volatile, even if there's an appearance of, oh, there's a bit more leeway given, it's still volatile in that when this kind of forms of patriarchal violence are still operating, when those kinds of dominant understandings of how order and power should be situated, when they get disrupted or interrogated, the response, I often tell people, like, I think that this idea, we really need to interrogate the idea of like Jamaica being extremely homophobic, or like this hyper focus on Jamaica as like the most homophobic country in the world, like the Time magazine cover, etc. Because I think, one, what does homophobia actually mean? I think there's a lot to pull out in that. And also for me, I find that in Jamaica, a lot of it is an anxiety around masculinity and an anxiety around respectability as it comes to terms gender and sexuality, and also an anxiety around what it means for us to be respectable subjects as Black folks who have been through transatlantic slavery and who have been through colonialism. What does it mean for us to be respectable subjects? And I think that there's an internal anxiety. And so when queer folks disrupt that, and I think violence ensues, a lot of that for me seems to come from the anxiety. That's like the violence is a manifestation of that internal anxiety, And I think with like with queer women, there's this, there's this leeway given, like Erin said, for all those reasons that you named. And also when then queer women disrupt that even further, the anxiety comes out, and that's when the violence erupts.
Yeah.
And just so we can go, good, I don't mind this work at all, but just to make some reference to the conversation that we're having. So as somebody from rural Jamaica, without having a safe, it was very difficult for us, or persons who are from rural spaces, to find safe spaces. So a lot of times we find the bush as a space of refuge and somewhere that is safe. I remember when I was younger and I was growing up in the country, and the first time I started realizing that I was into guys was at the river. I used to go to the river to shower, and that was the space where I was like, okay, I feel comfortable exploring myself within a very, it was very private because it was within myself, but I was fine. I was okay exploring myself within the confines of the bush. There are other guys at the river, other people at the river, and you're like, oh, this is so weird. Versus it being at your house. If you were at home, you could not interact with other male bodies like that because, who are you to be watching somebody at the bathroom? You know what I mean? Versus when you're at the river, it's an open space. People are stripping in front of you, whatever. So it becomes a safe space for you to explore yourself without anybody speculating or pointing finger at you. Why are you looking at me like that? Or what you thinking about? Or why are you going to the bathroom with this person? So it became a space. So the bush for rural persons is a safe space because it allows you the privacy to explore yourself without feeling called out or
exposed.
Yes, thank you, Erin.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like there's a lot of dichotomies happening in Leasho's work all the time. So like, you point out how the bush is a safe space, but the bush also has heirs. You point out how, the figures are, genderless, but there's something very opaque, like suggestively masculine and suggestively feminine about, the figures, independent of it bushes. Yeah, and I think
it's interesting with what you just said. In the dancehall space, that's how both male and female operate.
Yeah.
Because you have some dances that are solely female dances, you have some dances that are solely male dances, then you have an intersection where both male and female are both masculine and feminine at the same time.
Yeah, so it's interesting, that the dancehall space is a site of the rejection of the gender binary. Like that is interesting when you
Yeah.
like listen to the music and you listen to the lyricism of it all, because it's inherently gendered, because it's
It's
inherently
contradictory.
it's so contradictory, because
Uh-huh.
I was in preparation for this, I was talking to a friend about Rampant Shop by Five Talent Spice, and I was like, the song starts preemptively with stating that this is a heterosexual song. And I was like, if I listen to this song void of um, that warning, I would have never thought that this is for, like
Exactly.
people, So I'm like, that that balance, that way in which these things teeter back and forth, or the stating of things, but then when you get into the space to these, when you get into the space and the culture you adopt in the dancehall space, inherently like voids that, you know.
Well, because it's we know what's happening. The people in the space, maybe they can't articulate it,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they know what's happening, and so they're very strict rules. It's a very free space, but it's also a very police space, and you must know,
Mm-hmm.
like you were saying, there are dances that are for women, and men don't do that. And you could be queer. We don't care if you queer. You don't do that dance though,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And it's very policed, and the bush is not, right? And so when Kimla, when you said moonlight, right? And I thought when Jodi was about to say, I was about to say creates a frames the bodies. It sort of it 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 doesn't just delineate the bodies or the essences, but it also shows where they are one,
Yeah.
right? Where
Mm-hmm.
that point where they become one.
Yeah.
And the bush, right? Like you become a part of it.
Yes, exactly. It's a whole, which
And
is another intimacy. Like you
Yeah.
keep
and
naming all these different kinds of intimacies.
Yeah.
and I imagine that. So I had an opportunity to go to this space in Jamaica, very popular. They have Dub Club there, I think, right? And
Yeah,
so
up in the hill,
Yeah.
up in the
right,
hills, past
right
Papi. Yeah.
where the Japanese
Skyline.
guys
Yeah.
and man, I had a flicking ball, right? I mean, but because you can melt into the space,
Mm.
like you literally become a part of the space, and that's what dancehall is, right? You become a part of it, and the person who is so like the intellectual the person who's there intellectualizing the experience has missed it. You miss that
Mhm.
where you are part of the space in the bush and with the work,
Yeah, it's very
right?
embodied.
Yeah, the figures are a part of the bush, and so not just the delineation of the figures, but of the figures and the bush.
But
So
it's
Mhm.
they
interesting too because a lot of time earlier in the earlier days when we had a lot of parties for the community, most of the party were in way out bushes, way out up in the hills, and it's literally you're in a forest. So as it relates to creating spaces where we can be ourselves, it was normally in the bushes, either some private lawn or lot where they just put up some lights and they have the music, but it's very out of the way. It cannot be, it's off the beaten path where you can go and you can be yourself. So even this sense of vulgarity that you can see within some of Leasho's work, those when we created those spaces in the bush, it allowed us to be as vulgar and as sexual as we want, because it was as much as the dancehall space in and of itself was welcoming the sense of being and that we wanted to be, it was not acceptable within that space.
Mm-hmm.
hmm
So we
Yeah.
had to go and create a space that could that is still a dancehall space, but at the same time it still could accommodate the sense of being that we wanted to be without persecution or judgment.
What,
Yeah.
hmm
what's so interesting, and I don't know if Erin has had this experience, but I've been in parties where, it's heavy dancehall, it's heavy soca, it's heavy rap, like these genres of music birthed out of that cover a specific, kind lyricism, so the lights
hmm
off when the dance, everybody's sweaty, hot, and they just finished playing the most vulgar dancehall song, and you on your head, and then you look and it's 1:30 in the morning, and then you hear the lights flick on because now the dance over, and they start playing gospel music.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Another contradiction.
Right.
Ah,
So I understand, Kimalea, what you're saying about, creating or being in a space where Leasho is framing these figures in a space where they are encapsulated in that moment. They are fixed in that moment. That there's no gospel music or no lights to flicker on to like remove them from that space.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the necessity for to actually go to that space, because when you leave the bush, you leave the bush.
Yeah, and I think it's also like, I don't know. I think I really appreciated what you said, Jodi, about that one and that vibe, or like the statement that Vibes makes at the beginning of Ramping Shop, because I think that's also a statement because of the anxiety.
Yes.
Like, because actually dancehall music has so much, and dancehall culture has this space to think about gender and sexuality and relations in so many different, far more nuanced ways than kind of strict gender binaries or strict kind of constrictions of heteronormativity. Because of that, you have to almost lay on thick. You have to restate over and over again. Actually, but we're straight. Actually, but this is a straight song. Actually, but it's a straight dance. But it's because the anxiety is there, and so that's kind of their way of saying, okay, we want to make it clear that despite what you might think, despite what you might interpret, despite what you might see, this is still a heterosexual space. And I think that's for me, that's what I get from that. It's almost like a statement of this is the ethos of the song. You know what I mean? Like something like that. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, FYI. Is that that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very FYI, and there's a lot of FYI.
Right.
Like these things happen all the, things happen like that all the time in Jamaica, and I always just laugh because there's so many arbitrary things that Jamaicans decide are man enough to do that. Like, there's so many arbitrary, like the way you hold your hand, the way that you walk, the way that you stand up. Like, there's so many arbitrary things that are decided that actually that's too feminine. This is not, you wearing tight pants and a woman's blouse is not feminine. It's not too feminine because in dancehall. But if you walk with a slight, I don't know. Like, there's just so many, like,
popular one.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. And it's so arbitrary. And I think, I don't know, I think the other thing about the bush is that I keep going back to it. I think it's so important because a lot of the conversations about homophobia also are rooted in class. And I think, like, they're rooted in projections of Western countries projecting onto Jamaica. But also within Jamaica, there's this huge class, it's a very classist country and there's a lot of class divide. And the whole thing about the bush is also like a class thing of who actually has, because there are uptown gay parties in Jamaica that are happening at people's houses, and because they have space, and they can then select who they want to come to the space, and it's a very like who you have to know because somebody's home, right? And they have protection not only because it's a private space, but also because they have money. People are not going to infiltrate, like police or what, are not going to infiltrate this particular kind of space, right? So I think there's also this class dynamic that I think Leasho keeps naming throughout the work, which is really important.
It's like the bush can be safe. The bush is safe and dangerous at the same time, right?
Yeah.
The bush will hold you, but the bush will also consume you or kill you, and you could be a part of the bush, but the other things that the bush holds close in there could kill you too, in the same way that your partner could close in an embrace could kill you.
Exactly, and that's, oh my God, yeah. That's,
go on.
Go on. No, you're saying exactly it.
Kamala, go
with what you're saying, what came to mind? The subjection of Brother Snake. Because a snake normally in Jamaica or the tropics or in the Caribbean is a bush animal, is in the forest. And a snake, let's say, is deemed as something that is violent or hostile. And now when we're talking about that within the dancehall space, at least the way I'm interpreting it is it being a very masculine man or presenting as a very masculine man, and then they're being subjugated by another man. So it's like this person who is extremely masculine and they're perceived as being straight and they're perceived as being the ideal Jamaican man. But when they go into the bush, who knows what happens in the bush?
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's what I found very interesting about it.
I really like that you said that too, because I think that's really important. And I don't know, I think, Erin, what you said is something that I've been trying to hold with Leasho's work for a while, is that he has described it as explorations into Black queer intimacy, but exactly what you said, we don't know what the embrace is, right? We see figures, we don't know how many figures, we see figures closely intertwined, and the same one reading could be that there's loving intimacy, that there's caring intimacy, but also they could be fighting. Also, somebody could be attacking somebody else. Like, we don't know. And also that's also part of intimacy, right? So you can like relationships shift, dynamics shift, and what could start off as a loving, caring relationship can also lead to violence. That's all. Intimacy is not inherently a good thing. It's like a proximity is about closeness, and there's so many different kind of things that can come out of that. So it's like, yeah, in that picture, in that painting with Brother Snake, I don't actually know what's happening.
Yeah. So we're at the 8 o'clock mark. So I just want to open the floor. We got one question, and I want to acknowledge it. The question is, how might we read reggae with or against the queerness of dancehall? And how do y'all place its contemporary gender and sexual context? So thank you for your question.
That's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't think reggae, in my opinion, I don't think reggae explores sexuality as much as dancehall does. I think reggae more speaks to, yes, it does speak to intimacy, and it speaks to upliftment and a sense of liberation. But as it relates to sexuality and gender, I don't think it speaks to it as much as dancehall does. I think it's more very political. Reggae is more political versus dancehall. I don't think there is. I think it reads different. Speaking to something, reggae is more the subject that reggae explores different necessarily from dancehall, versus where dancehall is very explicitly very sexual and gender based. And very political at the same time. But I think reggae is more political than gender or sexual.
For me, it's interesting because I think, like, I don't know what the term, like, there's something about the sonic, like, I don't even know how to say this, like the way that reggae is created sonic, like there are particular kinds of beats, there are particular kinds of rhythms that come up in the reggae. And if you trace the histories of shifts between dub going into reggae, there's a way in which reggae, even because I do think reggae is very sexual, and I do think actually reggae talks about gender politics and sexual politics in a particular way, but because of how it is because of its kind of sonic, like it's something about the rhythm. It's something about the rhythm of reggae that gets read as less aggressive, that gets read as less aggressive, less kind of like there's not the same kind of hardness of reggae that there is in dancehall. And so I think dancehall gets read as more hypersexual, like because of the ways in which dancehall, like because of also like the ways in which dancehall is created musically, because I think when you read some of the lyrics of reggae songs, like they're very, they're very sexual. Actually, they're talking, and like not just contemporary reggae, but also like old time reggae, and so I think there's something about that that's really, I don't know enough about. Like, it would be interesting to talk to somebody who does music scholarship and also like thinks about that, about what it is about, because also reggae also it generates a particular kind of emotional response that's more like, even the way that people dance to reggae music is very different than the way that people dance to dancehall music. And like way, like the beats, like it generates up a different kind of emotional response that doesn't feel as aggressive or hard, and I think I'm curious about, because I don't know, because I'm like, is dancehall inherently more queer, or is it like, I think also there's this thing of like dancehall being associated with Black working class folks in Jamaica, and predominantly being associated with Black working class folks in Jamaica, and all of this, and like dancehall in relation to fashion, in relation to style, etc., that makes it that we're thinking about it in these ways that are more non-normative, which could then be interpreted as queer. But also reggae is also created by Black working class people in Jamaica. You know, like it's the same kind of roots of the like cultural production. So I don't know. I wonder like why. I feel like dancehall is just more explicit. I think it's just more explicit and more, because it's more vulgar and it's more blunt. It's almost easier to pick up on the queer gestures and actually maybe you need to stick with reggae a little bit longer and like meditate with it and be like, wait, I never realized, because there's also so many reggae songs I listen to and I'm like, wait, I didn't even realize he really said that. Or
Yeah, I think you're right.
Sorry.
The communication, how it's communicated.
Yeah, how it's communicated. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think, I've been to Jamaica 3 times and my DNA test says I'm 70% cannabis, right? So I'm a Jamaican now. And I think dancehall is about, is a space, is a tension between policing and rebelling. It's like dancehall is like explicit instructions on how to be a straight man and a straight woman, right? In these particular spaces, this is what you do to the woman, and you show her your cocky, and when you see it, you bounce upon it, and right. But then at the same time, in the performance, there's a rebelling from that attempt to police sexuality, right? So dancehall is this. The lyrics are a definite policing of sexuality, and you must be straight and remember the cocky is for the cookie and all the time. But in the performance now, right, and in the lyrics, the man is in charge, but in the performance, the woman is climbing up on the roof and WWE body slamming his cocky, right?
Should have brought the cocky,
right, right. And so I think there's that dancehall is that tension, which is a tension scene in like the downtown uptown tension, the property and vulgarity tension in that same space. I think reggae, a part of reggae for me is like it's like ska, like yele. It's like a half beat.
Yeah,
it's like the heartbeat. And it's different. And if I just say, a friend of mine said, a part of the reason why culture generally is hypersexualized is because all culture comes out of African space, like Black African space. But the only things they let us keep were the sex rituals, the fertility dances, the things about making more slaves, right? That's the only part of the culture that they let. It's just something, people talk about when they get high, but wouldn't it be interesting though, right? Wouldn't it be interesting though if the reggae music and that beat drives something different, and that dancehall space is driving that particular discussion about how we are supposed to, men and women are supposed to be with each other.
Yeah. Also, like, I don't know, Erin, you just said something that made me think about the beats. Like the way you were talking made me reflect more about, like, dancehall is really fast, right? Music is very fast. The way that people dance, like the lyrics are fast, the way that they're delivered are fast, and so there's not a lot of space. It's like boom, boom. It's like what do you call it? First not stand. I don't even know how it's stanza, chorus, whatever. Like or first verse, chorus. It's so there's not a lot of space in the songs. And the songs are also short.
Yeah.
And reggae songs, there's a lot of, especially the transition from thinking about ska and dub into reggae. Like there's a lot of open space in the beats. And I don't know.
Space for contemplation.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know where to go with this, but I do think that there's something about the space that, like, reggae, there's just more open space in reggae that is interesting sonically. Like, what is that? Like, what does that do? Like, what do we do in that? Whereas dancehall is telling us, it's like boom, 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 boom.
I know we have another question, so I just want to acknowledge that and then give this. I also think that we kind of like associate reggae with a kind of religious and a socially religious kind of aspect as well. So I think that a lot of reggae is, birthed out of like Rastafarianism, and the lyrics kind of like support that. We don't quite see space for a disreverence of that kind of religiosity in reggae versus dancehall.
Yeah, it's like a respectability. It's a respectability also in that, even though, like, I don't know, it's also contradictory.
It is.
It's also,
I mean,
you know.
based on the conversation, I mean, I think, and based on what Erin said, and it's like a yin and yang. So it's like dancehall and reggae, they complement each other. So one is more uplifting, and one is more like, okay, you need to be this kind of dog, and vicious and vulgar. When the next one is like, okay, you need to be loving and gentle. But at the same time, just like Javante question, there are music in dancehall. So we have like reggae. So we have like Sizzler. We have our favorite or famous reggae artist Bob Marley. You know, Mataman is so unjust. It is so subtle.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the way that it is interpreted compared to Boom Bye Bye is totally different because of the delivery.
Yeah.
So I think it's just like a yin and yang type of relationship.
Yeah, I also think dancehall is hyper scrutinized. Like I think I think between the two of them, even within soca, between like thinking about dancehall, reggae, and soca, and even you can add in other different forms of music that were been created in the Caribbean. I think dancehall is hyper scrutinized, and I think dancehall is blamed for inciting violence, blamed for inciting kinds of like vulgar behavior. I don't know, and I think a lot of that then gets back to the whole question of class.
I also, before we go to Leasho, because but I also think that because of the parallels of like dancehall and rap music as well, like
Yeah.
rap music is birthed from a specific, like that, which they came up in the 80s together. I think that.
But not just that, rap music and hip hop is founded by the descendants of Caribbean migrants and second generation, third generation Caribbean migrants.
So exactly. And it's a kind of blackness too. It's a particular kind of like volatile blackness that we get. Oh, we don't want. We need to be careful with that. Like there's a volatility with dancehall, which I think is dancehall, i.e., read as blackness, or like inhabiting blackness and black body and like your black body, my black body, I think is taken as particularly volatile.
For sure.
But and I think just for a moment, maybe I'm reading dancehall incorrectly because it's cathartic, right? It's the space where working class people get to do all the things they can't do. They can't cuss their boss. They can't. They know their boss cheating them. They can't cuss their MP. They can't cuss the policeman who trying to bribe them. They can't cuss their landlord. They can't cuss the shop man. The woman can't cuss a man for having another woman. The man, the man could slap the woman, but he most men aren't that, right? That's a stereotype. And dancehall is that space where people, it's like carnival, right? It's that place where you get to release. And so it is a class thing, and it is a perception, because you can't do that, right? It's the junglist again. You look at you doing that, you're so improper, when really you wish you were brave enough to do that in your bedroom or in your living room for your husband.
Yeah.
So Leasho Johnson, hi Leasho, ask, in terms of queer identity, I'm curious about the Bahamas' history with that socially. Is the Bahamas more open about gender queerness, less homophobic than Jamaica? You want to take this on, Erin?
Sure. Okay, so I would say, like, at the surface, we're less homophobic than Jamaica. Certainly, there's less physical aggression over the last 40 years. So we decriminalized buggery, sodomy in 1992. So I would say over the last 40 years, attitudes have been shifting and changing about visibility. I would say that I am a part of a team. The three of us, we were the first out gay people. Like, we outed ourselves. We're in the media. We were spokespeople. And now attitudes that would have been like 2003, 20 years ago, attitudes have definitely shifted. Homosexuality and sexuality are used by people in power. And most Bahamians, the fear, like that thing that we call the phobia, is rooted around perceptions about gay people in positions of power, because there are lots of them. So, for instance, a few nights ago, the Prime Minister spoke at an event called Meet the Policymakers. and this young queer advocate got up and said,
yeah,
um, basically, you're talking about the national plan. LGBT people are a group that you don't mention in the plan. Considering that your administration is the queerest administration in the history of the Bahamas, what we could expect from you? That's what he asked. And I thought to myself, if his administration is the queerest administration in the history of the Bahamas, then surely queer people are doing better than you would suggest that they doing with that broad brush, you know? And so I don't think he was half wrong. I can't be outing people. I'm not outing people. But there have been these shifts. There have been these movements. And I don't think the Bahamas is as homophobic as Jamaica. But I think the Bahamas will use homosexuality in an instant if it furthers their political agenda, their social or religious, right, to build social, political, or religious credit. They'll use the issue, right? They tend to only pick on people who are already in the public life or sort of we call politically exposed, right? But on a one-to-one basis, you'll find that people, if not empathy, sympathy, don't believe in beating up on the underdog, but are afraid that their children could be gay or that their children are gay. But that you find that most people learn that they still love their children, right? Like that their love about their children hasn't changed. What's changed is them, you know, the rest of them.
I think
so. But I also don't think Jamaica. I agree. Jamaica is not the homophobic place that they painted to be. It's not the most homophobic place in the world. It couldn't be. You know,
and also, what does that even mean? You know, to call a place the most homophobic place in the world. Like, what does that mean? No, sorry, go on. I'm just like listening to you.
Say, I felt safer in Jamaica than I did in the U.S. on a queer-oriented trip, right? Like I felt safer in Jamaica. And I tell people if I move, I don't want to go north. I'd rather go south. Maybe I can't be an advocate anymore, but I'd rather go south to Jamaica.
Exactly. And that, oh my God, like that I mean, that's the kind of nuance that I wish was happening. Like that kind of conversation was happening around this kind of question around homophobia. And for me, it's also like, you know, okay, the Bahamas is less homophobic than Jamaica, but then why is Jamaica, okay, like if we trace back, like, you know, the same enslaved Black folks who came to all these islands. So what is it about Jamaica and like Caribbean islands, particularly the English-speaking Caribbean islands, who were colonized by the British? They share so many cultural similarities, right? So why is it then that Jamaica is, quote unquote, the most homophobic or the most aggressive or the most? And I think those are the questions that I think are interesting to ask. You know,
but I think what's particular about the Bahamas is we solve problems with money, right? We have more dollars and cents, right? And so it's not a matter of being less homophobic, right? It's just a matter of being able to create safe spaces with money, right? And in juxtaposition to the safety of the bush or the need to to resort to the bush for safety. And I think that's maybe the only difference.
I was gonna say that I think that as the other Bahamian on the panel, that I think that there's like a theoretical and a practical dissonance that happens a lot here. So theoretically, a lot of Bahamians are homophobic. You know, they have that like that theory that comes directly from being like a Judeo-Christian nation. You know, that theoretically I do not agree, and it's this constant like the vibes got like romp and shop, like, you know, I'm going to say that I'm not, just so you know.
But just stick a pin. Did Vibes write that while he was in prison? Because that would explain why he put the disclaimer there.
No, that was pre-prison.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, he's still writing songs in prison. He's still releasing songs.
Yeah.
Look, still on Instagram in prison. So
sorry, Jodi.
Okay, so yeah, I think it's that dissonance, and I think that there's a difference between like, and we talked about this with April Bay's exhibition, like class comes into question here again. I think also gender expression comes in when you talk about like the umbrella of queerness. I think that persons who are non-binary persons and persons who like cisgender men who appear more femme, or cisgender women who appear more masculine, like that like ongoing or that existence in ways that doesn't fit into the gender binary, also vulnerability that is presented, that is met with homophobia.
Yes.
Rather than someone who is cisgender, plays by the plays by the binary, and then if people know that you're gay, that's fine. The practicality of your gayness then becomes the alarming thing. So it's like people,
Because you're not disrupting space.
for sure. So
Yeah.
so anything
And
like
even passing is a thing too, because like, I know here specifically, the more you present as white, it's easier for you to exist within Jamaica. So the
Yeah.
whiter you are, the easier it is for you to exist. And it's not to say you are necessary. I won't say you're accepted, but you are tolerated more versus a black Jamaican man with really nappy hair who presents as a gay man.
Yeah, and a lot of it is about a lot of it's about feminists too. And I don't know. I'm glad that you named, like, because I think also in the conversation about Leasho's work, like trans femininity and like trans masculinity haven't been also central to the conversation, and I think it needs to be. You know, I think it's a lot. Like I think similarly to the like what I think Erin was saying. You know, people still love their children even if they find out their children are gay or queer or whatever. Even the language of queer, it's like, you know, a lot of people don't use that language. So it's also interrogating what language we use and what it means to kind of implant US centric language into the country. But I think in Jamaica, it's like there are always queer people in the family. They're always queer, like, you know, like, and it's not a secret, like, you know who is queer and whatever. So if you grew up in a particular community, it's like people in the community know, oh yeah, you know, that person, him look funny, you know. And I'm like, but still,
I think the problem though with us is that we're extremists. So it's from one extreme to say, you know, you're a naughty man or you're a straight man. You cannot be in between. There's no in between. It's either you're one thing or the other.
Yeah. I also think it's just that I think it's also the anxiety of how other people will perceive you. So it's like, actually, you're my child, I might not have an issue with your queerness or the ways that you want to think about, like, express your gender, sexuality, desires, but I don't want other people to know, because it's important for me to present myself as a respectable citizen. And I've been told, and like the model for respectable citizen has been a particular kind of heterosexual, particular kind of cisgender, like, citizen, you know what I mean? And so I think it's that, once again, is that anxiety where it's actually like, if it was just me and you in the house and you're my child, I wouldn't care that much because you're my child and we have that intimacy. But it's like when we go out into public space, that's when the anxiety comes out, you know.
What my pastor is going to think.
All of that, exactly. And I think that's also the thing about growing up in small countries, in islands, where everybody know everybody, like everybody in everybody's business. People are nosy, and everybody's watching you. And so it's always this kind of anxiety of, like, I always tell people, you know, sometimes I want to be, when I'm in Kingston, I would like to just leave the house and not talk to anybody you know, but you can't do that. You always have to be engaging. You will always somebody you know. And so there's always this kind of like intimacy that is ever present. And so anything that you do, somebody will carry it back to your parents and say, oh, you know, I saw him doing this, I'm doing that, whatever. And I think that leads to this kind of anxiety. But I don't know. I do wonder, I'm like, what is it about Jamaica that has created this label of the most homophobic country and this aggression? I think that there's a lot of historical stuff that can be teased out in that.
Thank you.
But I mean, a part of it is a part of it is about the racist, classist nature of the global North and its advocacy, right? And so, and understanding the sort of origin of queer, I take it and appropriate it, right? And because most people don't identify as lesbian and gay, right? And I don't sleep with men. Like, I meet Bob in the bush, you know. I meet people in the bush, and we consume each other in the bush. They don't think about that language. And I think queer is a nice space for people who don't have to have a label, right? But we want to talk about them.
Yeah, and all those forms of language that you're saying, they're all valid, you know? Like, I think also it's like, we don't have to use gay, lesbian, queer. Like, we don't have to, like, you know, I think a lot of it also then disrupts this idea that these are static identities. And I don't think identity is static. Like, I think I don't think desires are static. I think desires shift. I think people grow. I think people I think desires just change, you know, as we live in the world. And I think sometimes we can't name them as gay or lesbian or like I think there needs to be space, you know, which is like the abstraction in Leasho's work, which is like the possibility in his work.
That's interesting. Yeah, to look at it like that, Gervais. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
You know, I thought of the work of the feminine, you know, Nancy pulling out or presenting the feminine of the even the person, right? You could be in the bush with yourself, and Nancy is presenting yourself to you. You know, anyway, in that
Absolutely.
space.
Yeah.
No, that's so good. Absolutely. Like I completely agree.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Kimalea, Gervais, and Erin, for this very dense and thorough and inspiring conversation. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Deep Hunting by Leasho Johnson is on view until this Saturday, July 23rd. And if you are abroad, we will be taking Leasho and Tessa Whitehead to the Armory Show in September 9th to 12th, I believe.
Amazing.
And our next exhibition is an emerging artist exhibition featuring 5 emerging Bahamian artists, which opens on July 28th. So
and you're curating it, right?
I'm curating it.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks for that. Yeah.
So thank you all so much, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, and it's nice to meet both of you. Nice to meet all of you through this.
Absolutely. Don't go anywhere.